the car that forced regulators to rewrite the rules. At first, it looked like a compliance dream. Clean results, stable behavior, no red flags. Then the questions began, and nothing looked simple anymore, because this car didn't break the rules. It revealed how incomplete they were. To understand why regulators were forced back to the drawing board, we need to revisit how automotive rules are written. Standards are built around measurable events, thresholds, limits, failures that can be triggered, recorded, and repeated. If something can't be tested reliably, it usually isn't regulated. This car lived in the space between those tests. It behaved differently not during extremes, but during transitions, the moments before instability, the seconds before thresholds were crossed. The vehicle rarely triggered existing safety systems because it rarely reached the conditions they were designed to respond to. At first, regulators celebrated that outcome: lower incident rates, fewer interventions, cleaner data. On paper, the car exceeded expectations without demanding exemptions or special treatment. It appeared to fit perfectly within existing frameworks. But engineers reviewing the telemetry noticed something unsettling. The car wasn't just compliant. It was evasive in the most constructive way possible. It prevented the scenarios regulations were designed to measure. Loss of control never escalated enough to be counted. Emergency systems rarely activated because emergencies rarely formed. The vehicle passed every test while quietly operating outside the assumptions those tests were built on. That success exposed a blind spot. Regulations assumed danger would announce itself clearly. Skid detected. Impact imminent. Failure observed. This car operated upstream of all that. It addressed instability while it was still ambiguous, before it could be classified as unsafe. Regulators began asking uncomfortable questions. How do you certify safety that never triggers safety systems? How do you measure prevention instead of response? How do you regulate behavior that avoids thresholds rather than crossing them? Existing rulebooks had no answers. The car complied flawlessly and still forced scrutiny, not because it was unsafe, but because it challenged what safety had been defined as in the first place. Meetings grew tense. Engineers and regulators spoke past each other. One side talked about continuous balance. The other talked about discrete events. The gap between them wasn't political. It was conceptual. And once that gap became visible, it was impossible to ignore. Because if cars could prevent danger without triggering rules, then the rules were no longer describing reality. They were describing history. And history, as this car was about to prove, was no longer sufficient to protect the future. The first response from regulators was hesitation. Existing frameworks had worked for decades. They were built on clarity, pass or fail, within limits or outside them. This car introduced ambiguity, and ambiguity makes institutions uneasy. Regulatory teams attempted to fit the behavior into familiar categories. They examined braking events, stability control activations, steering corrections, but the data resisted classification. The car rarely crossed thresholds. It lived below them, shaping behavior before it could be labeled unsafe. That created a paradox. The safest vehicle on record was also the hardest to evaluate. Engineers tried to explain what was happening in technical language: continuous load balancing, predictive stabilization, cooperative system response. Regulators listened carefully and struggled to translate those concepts into enforceable rules because laws require triggers, and this car avoided them. Pressure mounted from unexpected directions. Insurance companies noticed the anomaly first. Claims data didn't just improve, it flattened. Variability dropped. Risk models based on incident frequency began failing. Premium structures built around traditional assumptions no longer aligned with outcomes. That got attention. If risk could be reduced invisibly, without driver behavior mandates or intrusive control, then regulation had been targeting symptoms, not causes. Safety had evolved beyond the tools used to define it. Workshops were convened. Engineers, statisticians, psychologists, and policymakers sat in the same rooms, something that rarely happened before. The discussion shifted away from crash survival toward driver workload, system harmony, and instability prevention. New questions emerged. Should safety be measured by impacts or by the absence of escalation? Should certification consider near misses that never fully form? Should vehicles be rewarded for reducing cognitive strain instead of reacting error? The car forced those questions by existing. It didn't lobby. It didn't demand exemptions. It didn't break a single rule. It simply revealed that the rulebook described a past where danger was loud and obvious. This car made danger quiet. And quiet danger is the hardest kind to regulate. Because once prevention becomes a goal, regulation must evolve from policing events to understanding behavior. That realization marked the beginning of a long, uncomfortable transition, one where certainty gave way to nuance, and safety stopped being something you could trigger on command. The car had done its part. Now, the institutions responsible for protecting people had to decide whether they were willing to change too. The transition was anything but smooth. Regulators were being asked to govern something that left no obvious evidence behind. No skid marks, no airbag deployments, no dramatic failures to investigate. Just nothing happening. And nothing is difficult to certify. Pilot programs were launched quietly. Fleets were monitored under real conditions. Instead of waiting for accidents, analysts tracked instability indicators, microcorrections, steering entropy, braking hesitation, driver workload over time. The data painted a picture that unsettled everyone involved. Risk didn't disappear. It dissolved. Situations that normally escalated into incidents simply flattened out. Drivers recovered sooner. Panic responses softened. The car didn't override behavior. It reshaped the environment in which behavior unfolded. That forced regulators to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their rules were written for a world where danger announced itself loudly, where failure was discrete, visible, and measurable. This vehicle operated in the liminal space before failure, where intent, uncertainty, and human inconsistency live. New metrics were proposed. Stability duration instead of peak events. Cognitive load instead of reaction time. Variability reduction instead of threshold avoidance. Each proposal challenged decades of regulatory precedent. Lawyers worried about enforceability. Engineers worried about oversimplification. Policymakers worried about public understanding. The debates were intense. Some argued regulation should remain reactive, that prevention was too abstract, too hard to audit. Others countered that refusing to adapt meant regulating the wrong outcome. Again, the safest systems were slipping through the cracks because the rules were designed to catch failure, not prevent it. The car became a case study in every discussion, not as an exception, but as evidence. It showed that safety could exist without spectacle, that prevention could outperform reaction, and that measuring only what happens after things go wrong misses the most important part of the story. Gradually, language shifted. That bend mattered. Because once rules acknowledge prevention, innovation is no longer forced to disguise itself as compliance. It can aim directly at reducing harm instead of gaming thresholds. The car hadn't forced change through confrontation. It forced it through proof. By existing quietly, consistently, and safely, it made resistance harder than revision. And with that, the industry crossed a threshold far more significant than any crash test could capture. Safety was no longer defined by surviving danger. It was defined by preventing it from ever becoming visible. The new rules didn't arrive with a single announcement. They arrived through revisions, appendices, and pilot frameworks, quiet acknowledgments that something fundamental had changed. Safety was no longer judged only by what survived impact, but by what prevented it. Manufacturers adapted quickly once the signal became clear. Designs shifted upstream. Stability was engineered earlier. Driver workload became a design constraint, not a side effect. Systems were evaluated not just for response, but for restraint, for how little they needed to intervene at all. The car that forced regulators to rewrite the rules never demanded special treatment. It made special treatment unnecessary. By proving that prevention could outperform reaction, it reframed accountability. Responsibility no longer ended at compliance. It extended into behavior, experience, and long-term risk reduction. Cars were expected not just to protect people when things went wrong, but to help them avoid wrongness altogether. That expectation reshaped innovation. Engineers stopped designing for thresholds and started designing for continuity. Interfaces calmed. Feedback softened. Control systems learned to wait instead of interrupt. Safety became something drivers felt as confidence, not something they feared as consequence. Regulators, once cautious, began codifying prevention as a goal. Near-miss reduction mattered. Cognitive load mattered. Stability over time mattered. The language of safety grew more human, less mechanical. Looking back, the shift seems inevitable. But it wasn't. It required a machine that fit the rules so perfectly it revealed their limits. A car that passed every test and still made the test feel outdated. A product that didn't argue with institutions, but quietly outgrew them. The rules changed because reality had already moved on. And the car that made that movement visible did more than improve safety. It changed what safety meant. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The car